Hello, I'm delighted to be chairing this session of Meet the World featuring Nur-El, Jaffar and Janani Ambikapathy, two talented translators who are going to be talking about their practice and just any interesting things that they've encountered in their journeys as translators. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Arts Council of Singapore for their partnership in this event. And I'll just introduce both Janani and Nur-El, and we'll take it from there. So Nur-El Jaffar is an editorial consultant and an award-winning translator. She is a writer and she's written 11 picture books and one middle period novel. She is based in Singapore, working with the Malay language. She has translated 18 picture books, several short stories, poems, and her translations have appeared in various anthologies as well. She has written for television, a children's series that aired last year, and infomercials. And she has won several awards in Singapore, including the National Poetry Competition for Malay Poetry, and the Mastera Translation Prize in 2019. Janani Ambikapathy is a poet, critic and translator. She was born and raised in Chennai, in India, and her recent pamphlet, If Not Theirs, was published by Veer 2. Her poems and essays have appeared in the Poetry Foundation, Lana Turner, Firmament, Modernism, and Modern Poetry in Translation, amongst others. Her translations from Tamil have appeared or are forthcoming in Out of Sri Lanka, Tamil, Sinhala and English Poetry from Sri Lanka and its Diasporas, which I think is a fantastic book, and her translation is a fantastic translation in it, and Circumference magazine, and she's working on a non-fiction book about translating the Akara Nuru, which is a classical Tamil anthology of poems. Nur-El, maybe we could start off just by hearing about your residency at the National Centre for Writing.
Thank you, Shash. Hi, everyone. I'm in the NCW Virtual Residency Program with the kind support of the National Arts Council of Singapore. And when I was first approached for this program, I was offered this program, I thought about whether I should take the writing or should I consider the translation program. And I decided to take up the translators program. And I proposed to translate selected poems from this book, Gandura, which is written by Hatina Ahmad, who won the Singapore Literature Prize in 2022 for this book. It's a collection of her poems that she wrote when she was traveling in different parts of the world as well as in Singapore. And one of the reasons why I chose her book, because it's not often that we find literary works by women Malay writers in Singapore translated into English, especially if it's in poetry form. So Shash is my mentor. We started in June, and I've been learning a lot from her. And I'm sure I'll be learning a lot from Janani today, so because I have so many questions for her. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nur-El and Shash, for inviting me to this conversation. I'll just say a bit about my several translation projects. One of them is translations. I'm translating a contemporary Tamil poet. He lives in Chennai. He's written a book called The Happy Piglet, and some of the poems from The Happy Piglet are forthcoming in the Circumference magazine, and I'll say more about that during the conversation. The other kind of translation work that I do has to do with classical Tamil literature. These are the oldest surviving poems in the Tamil canon. Dating them is quite complicated, and I won't get into it here. But the anthology that I am working with, let's say that it was composed and compiled. These are anthologies, so they were compiled in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. So the corpus consists of 8 anthologies, Ettuthogai, a grammatical text, Tolkappiyam, as well as Pattupadal, 10 songs. Of the 8 anthologies, I'm trying to translate poems from one of the anthologies called the Ahananuru, which means 400 long songs of the interior, of the interiority. So they're mainly love poems. Probably the most well-known translation of a sister anthology of Ahananuru is the Kurundokai, is A.K. Ramanujan's Interior Landscape, that I think is quite popular in the Anglophone world. Yeah.
It's fantastic. Nur-El, I've really enjoyed our time together as well. And what I found interesting is that you are a children's translator working with picture books and prose, and you've turned to poetry. And I just wondered whether you could talk a bit about just some of the things you came across as you made that transition, and whether you enjoy doing poetry now, whether that's something you might carry on doing.
Well, when I translate children's picture books, I work with illustrations, and illustrations help to tell the story. So sometimes, when there are certain things that I'm not quite sure how to translate, the illustration helps. But there are times also when we had to take the illustration out, because the illustration doesn't if the illustration would be something that the target reader, which would mean the Malay children in Singapore, wouldn't recognize, wouldn't relate to. So, for example, there's one picture book from Turkey, and it was through they translated the Turkish text into English, and then from English I translated into Malay. So there's this illustration of a bridge, and it is a wordless page. But the bridge does not look like the bridges that you found in Singapore. So it would create a gap for the children, for the reader to understand, to go on to the next page. So we decided, I spoke with the publisher, and the publisher said that it's not possible for them to request for the original illustrator to redo the illustration. And besides, if they were to do a bridge, if we were to ask the illustrator to redo the bridge to suit the Singapore readers, then it would change. It would be something that's totally different from the other illustration, because the story is set in someplace else. So we had to remove the illustration. So that's one thing about translating children's picture books. That we also have to take into account the illustrations available to us. And with prose and poetry, when we have when there's a certain phrase in the original language, right, or in Malay, and I want to translate to English, if there's no one-to-one or equivalent, then I can just expand it in English, right, for the English reader to understand. But then when it comes to poetry, I have to work with the economy of words, and then that is a challenge. From that prose to poetry, it is something that I'm still learning. And I don't think it will ever end. There's always something new, right?
Yeah, I think we're always learning, all of us. And it's never finished, is there? Translation's never finished. That's really interesting. And Janani, just from picking up what Nur-El said about translating something like a saying or some sort of cultural, that is easier to handle in prose, but when you're dealing with classical Tamil texts. How do you bridge that gap between antiquity and a modern audience, maybe based to the West?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we often talk about, right? Who are we writing to? Who am I writing to? The audience, how we imagine the audience, that definitely comes into play, whether it's an Indian person or a Tamil person or a Western person who doesn't know anything about the culture. I guess one of the interesting things about these classical texts is that there's very little evidence, archaeological evidence available for this time, and there are no historical texts. So these poems are the only things that are available from that time. So in a way, what we know about that culture is also what we know through the poems. And in terms of turning them into, I somehow don't struggle too much with in the sense of modernity, because these are love poems, and they are quite they sit quite well with, I think, a modern ideas of female desire and the way the female desire is expressed, and there is a kind of masculinity that might be harder to come to terms with, but I don't struggle with the themes. I struggle with the words and the decorative prose, or the decorative words, decorative language. It can be so baroque, and it can sound really beautiful in Tamil, but not that beautiful in English if I were to write it out. And I think there's also the ghost of the A.K. Ramanujan and his mind-blowing, minimalistic, ecstatic translations. So I think I've gone the other way, and the anthology that I'm working with is also much longer. The lines are longer, the poems are longer. So I'm not going for that kind of punchy, yeah, that kind of sexy effect that Ramanujan had on the poems. And there's kind of an interesting characteristic in, to go back to your question in terms of how do I deal with idiomatic usage. There's an interesting thing that happens in these Tamil poems, which is it's called Ullurai Uvamal, which just, there's an image, there's a feeling, and there's an image, and the feeling is on the inside, so aham, and the image comes from the outside. It's usually set in the natural world. There's a peacock, and there's an egg, and there's a monkey playing with the egg, and the egg probably stands in for the love. There's some kind of a resonance with the interior feeling and this exterior image, and that relationship is not always clear. It's not quite like metaphor. It's not symbolism. It's something else. It sets off an idea. It sets off something about the feeling, but it doesn't quite explicate what it is, and up to the interpreter. And I see myself as an interpreter as well as a translator. So I spend a lot of time sometimes writing out entire paragraphs, just close reading these poems and thinking about what the resonance between this image and the interior feeling is. And is it indifference? Is it coldness? Is it longing? And then how does the monkey and the egg what does it have to do with the longing? So it takes me pages and pages of actually thinking through the poem and then picking out what I think is the most relevant or the most beautiful part of the poem. And I often also don't try to fix the meaning. I want to leave some of that fuzziness in it. So I don't want to fix any of the meanings in any case.
No, because classical Tamil poetry is based on Thinnai, isn't it? And the landscapes, the poetics of landscape, which could be fluid between poets, but it's also quite constraining. And you can't ignore one for the other. So, I mean, something that maybe both of you might come across is how do you translate flora and fauna? Do you do an English equivalent? I mean, how do you paint these pictures that are based so much in the landscape? Do you come across that as well, Nur-El? Or
well, with prose, it's much easier to me because I can slip in the description. If the scientific word, if the scientific name is, I can't use the scientific name, but and then So there was one time I had to translate a particular kind of sugar cane. I can't. So the name is egg sugar cane, but I just had to expand it by describing what the sugar cane looks like, because this is a story about a man who has his yard and was describing the different plants in his yard to show his closeness to nature. Because this story is about how a man who lived in an island, who's a fisherman, and who's forced to move to the mainland. He has to leave his village in the offshore island and move to the mainland in Singapore, and he has to stay in a flat. So, yeah. So the author wanted to paint this image wanted to have this contrast. So I spent quite some time making sure that the reader knows the things that he has in the yard, the flowers. And there, I can't remember, there was this flower, I can't remember its exact name, but there is an English equivalent. But if I were to put the English word in, it just didn't sound nice. It didn't weave well with the others. So I just kept the Malay word.
Yeah, fruits and flowers are a problem. They're a big problem. I, depending on the poem, I sometimes translate them, as in I just there's a poem that I was translating in which there was some kind of rotting meat against these flowers, and there was a relevance. There was a fragrance of the flowers set against the rotting meat. So I just sort of named the qualities of the flower instead of naming the flower itself. But in other poems, the quality of the plant or the tree has something to do to what the character does in the poem. For instance, creepers show up a lot in classical poems, and there's a pepper creeper around the sandalwood tree. And this is important because there is usually, well, there's one poem that I'm working with, there is a monkey who is sitting at the bottom of this tree and looking up at the fruits, and he's just too lazy to, there is a creeper and he could easily climb up the creeper and reach the fruits, but he won't do it. He just hangs around hoping he'll find some toddy, rotting fruits that can turn into alcohol. So that image has something to do with the indifference or the laziness of the man to reach the woman that he easily could. In those kind of circumstances, I can't just I can't not mention that it is a creeper. There's a point or a logic to this. But one of my favorite things that Wong Mei, who translated the Tang Dynasty poets, and I think she comes across lots of these kinds of fruits and birds and loads of birds, and she says that the birds are, if you remove the birds from the Tang Dynasty, then if you remove the bird noises, the canon would fall silent. So many bird noises, and that these birds are as good a guide to her as any other sinologist. So in a way, I should just think of these fruits and flowers as indologists.
Just a side note, you mentioned something about the sound, the bird sound. One of the difficulty, the challenges in translating children's books from English to Malay is sound, onomatopoeia, right? And we had to find what's the Malay equivalent for this sound. For example, one of my picture books, it is achu, right? The sound of it is a story about allergies, right? And the title is achu. And somebody pointed out, I sent it for a competition, and the jury pointed out that achu is not Malay. Achu is English. So we had to find the Malay equivalent for achu, which is achim. So,
So you sneeze though, doesn't it?
yeah.
If you sneeze at chew,
Yeah.
I haven't heard many people sneeze at chim.
Yeah. So
Oh, I do quite a few at chews, I think. Oh no, that's really. But something you said, Nur-El, it's just stayed with me, that with the bridge that you had to remove, I think you said that it was a wordless page.
Yes. Other pages had text. The only page without text. So so we felt that it was okay to remove the page.
Okay, because I was just wondering, because you wouldn't be translating anything there anyway.
Yeah, but we had to I have to go and check the story. You have to make sure that the story flows, right? And then that there's no there's no gap, or there's a certain break where the child looks at it. What is this supposed to mean? How does it connect to the story?
So do you find that you're also, when you're translating picture books, translating images as well?
Yes.
On top of the word?
Yes. Yeah. In a way. Yeah.
Right.
I have to make sure that the text matches as well, and see it correlates, and it's something that is understandable for the reader in Singapore, for the Malay reader in Singapore. So I had to translate name of cakes, desserts, to suit more domestication involved with children's books.
I wonder, Nur-El, if it's more difficult or easier for you in a very defined audience for your children's books, in a way, while they're children. And that's very different from, I assume, the kind of audience that's reading your translated poetry. And I wonder, having this kind of readership in your mind, how that affects you, the way you make word choices.
For children's books, I have to be very careful to make sure that the words that I choose are within their vocabulary range, right? But there's also this thing about, I want them to learn new words, right? But on the other hand, I have parents and teachers telling me that this is too difficult for their child. So that, so there's always this negotiation, right? How far in terms of because the Malay language, we have this thing called imbuhan, which is basically prefixes and affixes, and it's really part of our conversation and the way we talk. We're supposed to have that, but for children, then you're supposed to, in children's books, you're supposed to minimize the appearance of verbs with those affixes and prefixes, but in Indonesia, because I translate picture books from Bahasa Indonesia to Malay, in Indonesia, they use a lot more of those kind of words compared to Singapore. So I will have to expand, sometimes I have to cut the sentences, or, just adjust it for the Singapore reader. With poetry, then with prose, I think there's more freedom in a way, because I can leave it up to the reader to interpret their own way, in a sense, right? There's this freedom for the older reader. But again, in poetry, then there's a certain there's only certain number of words that can fit into a line lengths compared to prose. Although with prose, I have to look into the number of words also. The publisher will say, I'm taking too long, too many pages.
I think, Shash, we've talked about this before. I think it would be useful to imagine an audience of all children. Nur-El's idea that we talk about something familiar, but we also introduce the audience to something new. So we maybe just imagine the audience for Tamil poetry as introducing them to something new, rather than worrying that they might not know what we were talking about. Like you were saying, go find out what this flower is, go find out what this tree is. I'm introducing you to a new world.
Yeah. Well, I don't tend to translate flowers, but I can see it's a problem when you're dealing with Thinne and Akam poetry. You can't get away from them at all, from the flora and fauna. But but I tend to keep the Tamil words in, as long as it's easily findable on Google, and you can go. And I'm not very good at flowers anyway. I'm not good in England I can't remember many of the flowers from Sri Lanka. So it's all a learning curve for me as well. So, that's really interesting. And the other thing I was thinking, and I wonder whether there's a crossover between Malay and Tamil, the use of sort of proverbs and sayings. And for me, Tamil literature is just shot through constantly with idioms and sayings and wisdom that's passed on through generations, that is sort of there's a shorthand and you just know what they mean. They mean they're quoting from Thiruvalluvar or whatever. And I suppose you come across that a lot, Janani, with translating the Ahananu. Do you have a problem moving that into the modern world? So this sort of saying from a truism from antiquity, can you find an equivalent in modern 21st century?
I come across more truisms, perhaps, or references to truisms, or references to antiquity in the contemporary poems that I translate. So that's the kind of problem that I often deal with, where the contemporary poet is making a reference to a poem or a theme or a motif or a symbol from antiquity, and this poem is written around that theme, and then someone who doesn't know Tamil literature from antiquity to the contemporary times, they just wouldn't know what the poet is talking about. So in those cases, I translate to the best of my abilities to give it a sort of a prehistoric flavor, or a flavor that points to something very old. I mean, whatever the poem is trying to evoke in terms of this older time, without the geographical specificity of that being in Tamil Nadu. And I think that's really that's the best I can do. There's something about time. There's something about oldness that this poem is trying to evoke, and I try to bring that in. But more specific meanings, I don't do them. I just because it then just becomes, I don't know, like an essay. It's no longer fun. The poem is no longer interesting. It's just something. No.
So these sort of signposts to show how clever the poet is, that they come from a tradition of verse making, that they can trace themselves back to Sangam literature.
Yeah. No, because I think someone who reads the poems in English will just think that this poet is fascinated with some kind of old antique canon was from, and maybe a very enthusiastic, curious reader might look up if there is a comparative canon to the Roman antiquity or Greek antiquity. It's not unlike English poets drawing from that canon, but that's sort of fallen by the wayside in English poetry. But I guess, as I said, an intelligent reader would immediately think, okay, maybe they are referencing a different canon, and like Nur-El said, I can only depend on the curiosity of my reader, ignorance of my reader.
Yeah, it's still a valid. I mean, we're so used to classical Greek and Roman references peppering poetry now, even now. Not as much as they were doing it in the 18th century, but there's still the odd throwaway comment, and the current trend in reimagining classical mythology, especially women writers writing about women, classical women. It's a fascinating, and we're still fascinated by it. And I feel as if there should be space for so many more mythologies and so many more antiquities, that we should be bringing those into a wider readership anywhere. And why should it be contained just to South Asia? because the Greek and Roman worlds are just as foreign to a modern reader as Tamil Nadu is to a modern reader in English.
Wouldn't you? But that's so not the case somehow. I mean, the Greeks and the Romans, even farther away. I'm talking about the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. Some of the Roman texts are even farther away, but and I'm not sure what. It's the kind of weird European identity that's tied in with maybe these sort of antiquities, whereas they think anything else is extremely foreign. It's too far away. But my hope is that, A.K. Ramanujan and then the interior landscape, and then Vivek Narayanan is working on another version of the Kuruntogay, and then there are many classicists and there are Indologists. So maybe collectively we can create an imagination, a world that one can reference back. But I think at the level of the individual, I cannot make my poet bring back a canon. So I'm not even going to try.
And Nur-El, I think you were saying that Hatina Ahmed, who you're translating, at the moment, that she was writing at a time when Singapore had broken away from Malaysia, sorry. And so there was a sort of a new world being formed. And how did she build a bridge between those two worlds, between the old and this new thing that was New Singapore? And does that reflect in her poetry?
Most of her poems that touch on the separation would start with a bit of nostalgia, right? And she would relate the problems, the challenges that came along with development, with modernization and globalization, and then it would end with there would be different endings. One poem ended with the narrator talking about the narrator being regretful of the way she dismissed her grandmother's yearning to see the fireflies at the beach. The other one ended with a note of pragmatism. It's from the perspective of, I would say, a middle-aged woman who compared world machinations, political maneuvers to a trip to the market. And she ended it with a sense of pragmatism. And there's another one with hope. So it's a variety of responses to similar reactions or commentary on the transformations, the development that Singapore went through.
And it's using quite a lot of sort of domestic details.
Yes. Yeah, okay. I like, that's one of the reasons why I pick up. I like her poetry, because she can set something that sounds mundane, that appears mundane, but if you look deeper, you know that she's alluding to something significant in the social cultural history of the Malay community or Singapore. And yeah, so it's not something that, it's not a protest that's out there in your face, but it's subtle, and you have to go further into it, which is a challenge, because she can use a phrase, and if for someone who's not familiar with what the Malay community went through, what Singapore went through, then they just take it as that. But someone who's familiar would say, yes, she's talking about this event, she's talking about this, and then you feel, and then there's that kind of like, so good, that kind of that kind of response.
It's bearing witness in a way, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Have you got anything you can read that shows this sort of? And I wondered whether you had some of your translations.
Oh, what I have is, the one about the clock is not so much about the social cultural history thing, but it's about one of the things that she has in her collection is the thing about living within your cultural and social cultural dictates, right? And the place of women. And throughout her collection, there are a few poems that's about women claiming their place in the world. But Hatina comes from a generation where she grew up with a very conservative, it's a very conservative milieu, still traditional, right? She was born in 1955. So there's one where she talked about, she compared marriage to a clock. So shall I read it? It's just, okay.
Yeah, that'd be lovely.
Okay. It has been there far too long. Up the wall, its hands stay still. Ever loyal, even it stopped ticking. Left alone to wait, collecting dust. Without vigor, without desire. Until the end of time. I asked my mother if I could get a new clock to refresh my room, to let me breathe anew, to live as I willed. No, she said. That clock is bound to you. It is your fate. The end of
Gosh, that's harsh, isn't it? Oh,
That's a really wonderful poem.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yes.
and quite harsh.
very. Because you've mentioned this before, but hearing the translation and that juxtaposition between so that I can breathe and so that I can be free, and then no, you're bound to it. Oh my goodness, amazing.
Yeah, and does she say that I can live as I will,
Live as I
so that
will,
I
yeah.
can live? Yeah, and then it's incredible, that line break, so that I can live as I will, and then the mother just says no because it's predetermined.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah, fantastic. Because she's also, and something we haven't talked about, she's also a Muslim poet.
Yes.
So strands of it. So how do you translate religious references? I mean, do you have to bear in mind? I suppose you need to think of your audience even more so.
Yeah. So in her collection, there are a few religious so there are few words connected to Islam. More of the rites like Ramadan, breaking fast, the rituals like and words to mark time based on the time of prayers, right? So that's one of the things that when I first came across this poem, the about the grandmother with the fireflies, the word asar, ASR, it means that there's the time for the afternoon prayer. But when we ask somebody to the asar, right, or it can mean has the time for this afternoon prayer started, or have you done your prayers, right? And then just that one word, manaj, it means reciting the Quran. So, manaji is just 3 syllables and reciting the Quran, and then asar, and those 2 words are in one line. So how do I, I can't expand everything into one line, translate to one line. So I had to break it up, and I chose to use the word asar, make it into another, to more of setting the time of the poem, the time frame. That's all. Yeah. Of course, but then there are also other poems that I choose not to translate at all and just leave those words as it is, and leave it to the readers to look it up. Of course, I have considered whether I would to put a note or gloss, but that's something further down the road.
I wonder whether we can hear any Tamil translations, Janani.
Yeah, Sure. Um, I'll read from the poems of the contemporary Tamil poet. His name is Veil, and I'll read a small sequence from the book I'm a Happy Piglet. This poem is also called the title poem, I'm a Happy Piglet, the title sequence. First generation. My loyal pig. I had known her for several hundred years. Subject to need, I would carve up a portion of her flesh. She would say calmly, I am made of the wheat and the water of your house. One day, I had unexpected visitors. I went to the backyard, stood silently. She understood, laughed, lay down on the butcher's block. I whispered in her ears, I'll turn Sunday's twilight into a red sky of your blood. Your meat will be fragrant in the fresh yellow flowers. And then it wasn't difficult to slit her throat. The next day, when I was asleep, her piglet ate my pinky. It hung its head in remorse. I thought it was a carrot, but I saw in its eyes a little moonlight defiance. Second generation. That pig, after her heart had been torn out, look, she drags her heavy remains and speeds into the forest. We chased her with a spear. She plucked a red cluster of hibiscus, placed it in the place of her heart. She ran faster, disappeared. Since I told this story, my wife, the crone, crowns her head with hibiscus. Rust grows on the blood-stained spear. It hasn't stopped raining. Third generation. In the afternoon glare, a brave pig mother was struggling to turn drain water into milk. Her piglets were skipping after the 12 swinging nipples. A history calms in the stirring of their tails. The light in their eyes is persuaded by time.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's quite a powerful sequence.
It is.
Yeah.
And you've got all sorts of notions of female sexuality and desire and the male gaze, male appropriation, and oh wow.
I mean, if this one, yeah, the poet and I had a long conversation about it because as you might know, Shash, it wasn't, he didn't always use she, sometimes he used it, other. And then we had a conversation about, and I considered retaining it. It ran, it disappeared, and then we talked about it, and then I said, could I replace it with a she? And then we decided that, okay, we might, maybe it takes away something from other kinds of implications, but then it brings in something as well. So then I'm
well, I suppose it gives the pig, whoever the pig is standing for, a sense of agency as well if you replace it with a she.
Exactly. And he wanted that. The poet wanted, because it's a kind of allegory for the exiles and the downtrodden. He kind of charts the territory of the pig through history, including the Buddha's last meal which was pork, and then that killed him. So this is a sort of a history of the downtrodden, but the pig is not without a fighting spirit.
Yeah.
As a kind of a it has red hibiscus for its heart, and it has a defiance.
And I could trace the thin through that as well, in just as the odd references. So the rainy season, and and also it's going on with the second generation, so that the piglet's got a spirit as well, and you could just see.
The piglets are all born with the kind of a glint and wagging tails and resistance. They're as cheeky as they are resistant. I was really drawn to this sequence.
Yeah, it's amazing. Oh, thank you for that. Thank you both of you for those two fantastic translations.
Thank you for asking us to read.
No. Was there is there anything you want to ask? Because I've been hogging all the questions. and I didn't want to. If you want to ask each other,
I have a question for Janani. Is there with the poetry that you're translating, are there forms that in the original language, are there poems that come in a set format? That there are rules of presenting the poem, and how do you keep to that format when you translate it to English?
By rules, do you mean?
Oh, okay.
Font, in terms of font.
Yeah. And for example, in Malay, the Malay pantun, we have the four verses, and it's A B, and there has to be a certain. You can't reach this. You have a set number of syllables per line, things like that.
So no, something like the pantun doesn't exist, but I guess in terms of the contemporary poet that I'm translating, that's free verse. So and I try to replicate some of the rhyme, etc., like the history and story, that kind of thing in the poem that I just read. But otherwise, it's free verse. But in terms of the antiquity poem, the classical poems, there's a line length. That's one of the. It's impossible to replicate other kinds of constraints, but line length is something that I really want to stick to, because if there's 14 lines or 15 lines, there's a amount of space that's available for the image and the amount of space that's available for the feeling, and there's a quickness or longness. There's a kind of time scheme to it. Within these 7 lines or 14 lines, you sort of understand what's coming to you, and if you explain a little bit more, then it fixes a meaning. It determines something, and I think these summer poets were working against that sort of determination. So I think what you get within 14 lines is what you are supposed to get, and no more. So I try my best to stick to it, but it's quite difficult. As I said, for instance, if I have to talk about a creeper and if I have to waste 3 words on saying that it's a creeper, so I guess I'm conscious of a kind of a poetic time contained by these poems, and how quickly or how long should you get to what she's feeling, the protagonist is feeling. So
this poems that you translated or you are translating, have you do you have poems where they are like more than one person, different voices within one poem? And how do you differentiate that? Like this is this person, this verse is spoken by this person, and
with the classical poems, there are set characters. There's the male protagonist, female protagonist, then the concubine, then the female protagonist's best friend, then his mother, her mother, passerby. So they're these dramatis personae, and they've been already defined. I say defined, but this is a kind of colophonic material that was added. Who says what? So every poem begins with he said and she said. People familiar with Ramanujan's translations will know that it always begins with he said and she said, and it tells you who the he or the she is. So the best friend is now speaking to the man, or the stepmother is now speaking to the girl, that sort of thing. But this sort of colophonic material, I tend to, now wary is not the word, but I'm aware of the fact that they were added by medieval commentators. So sometimes it can say something about this person A is saying this to person B before her marriage, but then marriage doesn't really appear in the poem at all. And we're completely indebted to the medieval commentators who revived these manuscripts, etc., and added all of this material. So I guess the commentary tells you who's saying what, but I'm also trying to be aware of the fact that this is sort of try to listen to the poem, if that makes sense. Try to listen to who might be speaking, and maybe it's not always necessary to know who is saying it.
Do you come across that a lot? Different voices within a poem, Nur-El?
There's this one poem, The Grandmother and the Fireflies, because you have the narrator, I assume it is a she, the narrator talking about what the grandmother is doing, and then the grandmother talks about how life was then by the beach, about the fisherman, and about her husband, the master fisherman. And then she went on, and then the grandmother began to sing a song, and then the grandmother recited a pantun. Then came the narrator, and then the narrator ends with the narrator regretting how she responded to the grandmother. So that's a bit of I have to find a way to differentiate that this is the narrator, this is the grandmother, because she for the grandmother's verses for the grandmother, she presented it in a paragraph of run-on lines, and each line rhymes, which each line ends with a rhyme with the next one, and then after that again the grandmother, and then you have the pantun. So the pantun I had to translate. So I had to decide to how do I translate the pantun? Do I paraphrase it? Do I shorten it? Or do I keep the pantun format to indicate that this belongs to the grandmother, and how the grandmother speaks in a certain way compared to the modern narrator?
What drew you to this collection? Why did you decide to take on?
I wanted to learn. I wanted to do something different, right? And this is such an opportunity for me, I won the prize for poetry translation, and that was, I think it was like 2019. And after that, I stopped translating poetry because I was focusing more on my writing and my children's books. And then the opportunity came, and we said, okay, since I got a prize, it means something. So let's give it a try. And as I mentioned earlier, what I like about what attracted me to Gandura was the different themes she touched on, with the perspective of a woman, who grew in a certain period, and the poetry where the main subject, the poems where the main subjects were women. You have the one that I read just now about the clock, but there's also another poem where she talks about a woman who's going against her oppressor, and she compares and she writes and she uses the imagery of a woman removing her gandura, her robe, right? Even though there's the amount of pain that she's feeling as she in the whole process of her removing the robe. So you have that kind of someone who's trapped in the clock poem, but then you have someone who's fighting for her independence in Gandura, and then you have a few other poems that talks about love and passion and sensuality, and especially the one with notes of sensuality. The way she writes it is like so coy, and so it's not blatantly sexy, but it's just so sensuous, and it's something that I have not come across in my limited range of poetry that I've read in Malay, to be honest.
That sounds fantastic. I look forward to reading this collection.
I have to finish it first.
I've read many drafts of some of the poems, and they're just so lovely. And Nur-El's you've got such a lovely ear for poetry, because you do just do it naturally, and I've so enjoyed reading your translations. So,
Thank you.
No, I think it's going to be a good book when you bring it out. I think we're sort of coming to the end now, and it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you both very much for talking about translating from Tamil, for translating from Malay, translating across time, across cultures and flora and fauna, and just the joys of translating, I suppose. And I'd like to thank the National Centre for Writing for allowing us to have this conversation, and the Arts Council of Singapore as well for their support of this residency. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janani.
Thank you
Thank you, Sanj. Thank you, LCW.